So I actually went back and wanted to look at his whole book, Davar B'Ito. This is one of many books that he wrote, but this is the book that he wrote the same, right after the Hamburg Bezdin takes him to task. And so actually the whole book really is a response. I was talking to Dan about this, but maybe the way that we need to see him is as a reformer. Maybe we need to say, okay, he's an early reformer. What does it mean to be an early reformer? Maybe it's not exactly how we thought about it. Now, that being said, there's probably a range of early reformers. And here certainly is on the more, lack of a better term, traditional side, I would think. But I don't know. In 1819, maybe. Some of this still seems radical to us, like taking out references to the redemption. But he writes, so he begins the book with Shar Torah, and it's about like 25 things that he believes need to change about Orthodoxy, about Judaism, and about prayer. And it's basically a defense of reform of the Hamburg Temple. And says, I've already written that mitzvah le'avota, that he first begins by writing about non-Jews and Jews who are not religious, that they are considered, that they are made in the image of God. And even if they're not Jews, they're not considered idolaters today, meaning he's referring to Christians. And that changes halachically what you do with regard to them. Yeah, maybe. So I was just mentioning that I looked back in the book. I wanted to look at the book kind of as a whole, this book of Rabbi Horan's, and essentially I think maybe what we need to do, I was saying, was see him as an early reformer and just ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a reformer in 1819, right at the beginning? And that being said, there's a spectrum probably of people in the reform movement. Not that there's a movement yet. It's just a place to daven. And obviously he comes from a very traditional place, extremely learned place, although there's some argument perhaps about that also. So in this book, he begins by arguing that non-Jews today are not idolaters, meaning the non-Jews in Europe. And therefore, the halachic, our halachic relationship to them does change. If they're not idolaters. It means you have he'll argue that we have obligations to them, a kind of ger toshav. There's a concept of a stranger in your midst who, if they're not an idolater, they keep the 7 laws of Noah. You have obligations to them, obligations to support them, you have obligations to return their lost object, that kind of thing. So he says, now see that the nations around us, Shochne Europa, those who live in Europe, even Mavad Shekiblu mitzvos Torah Adam, because they have taken upon themselves the 7 mitzvahs of Noah, and they believe in prophecy, they believe in the Torah of Moses, right? In other words, they may have their own testament, but they do believe in the Torah of Moses, and they fear God, and they L'dvarav charedim, they shake before God's word. So lo levad shem nichlalim bichlal chasidei umot haolam be'shem chelton haba. Not only are they considered the righteous of the world and have share in the world to come, but also he says we need to apply to them the phrase, "Do not hate your brother in your heart." Mishahu b'mikti says that there's a Gemara in Bava Kama that says anybody that is b'miktzas mitzvos nikra achecha, anybody who shares some of the mitzvot with you is called your brother. So it's interesting that this is what he begins with, right? He doesn't begin with a defense. Now he's defending himself to the Hamburg Bezdin. This book is written right after that. He doesn't begin with a defense of reform. What he begins with is a bigger vision. Who are we in Europe in 1820? Who are the Jews in Europe, right? What does it mean to be a Jew in Europe? Do you see yourself as part of an insular community that's separate? The non-Jew is out to get you. Or do you see yourself as a European, as a now, this is not foreign to us. I mean, this is, the difference between living in, Muncie and living in Washington, D.C. How do you view the world around you? How do you view yourself in that world? Uh, and I think those things don't seem to me to have changed that much. And he is saying we're part of European society. They believe in the creator of the world. And he's arguing here that when it says "Uvechukotehem lo telechu," do not go in the way of the non-Jew. Now remember, that's a very key phrase. We've seen shuvot, we've seen responsa that their argument against the Hamburg temple, against having an organ, against having prayer in the vernacular is do not walk in their ways, right? Against having a chazan who wears a robe. Right? Many years later, Rabbi David Tzvi is going to write a tshuva that says, the real problem with all of this is don't walk in their ways of the non-Jew. So he begins by arguing here that the concept of they're not walking their ways does not apply to European Christians in 1820. He says, these people around us are not, that's not what the Torah is referring to. The Torah is referring to idolaters. As it says, Kamasa Eretz Mitzrayim, Kamasa Eretz Canaan lo tasu. Do not do like the ways of the Egyptians or the ways of the Canaanites. That's the azhara. This is the warning for do not walk in their ways. And what is that referring to? That's referring to idolaters. And we're worried about us worshiping their idols. Okay, that's the non-Jew. What about the Jew? He writes that, says, and what about other Jews? Even though other Jews are not taking on all the commandments, they certainly are our brethren. If they're called our brother, they're definitely part of our nation and part of our loved ones. And we know that according to Hillel, do not, love your neighbor as yourself, or do not do unto others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. It's the center of the Torah. So, that's the most important thing. It says the difference between us and other people is just our ritual practices. It says loving your neighbor as yourself is the whole Torah. Hillel says, the rest is commentary. He also have a statement in Pirkei Avot that's the main thing in the Torah. And he says every Jew is warned not to hate another Jew, whether not to hate another chavera, not to hate their fellow, whether that's a non-Jew or a Jew. Not to hate your brother in your heart. And I think he's also getting here not only at we need to be unified with all the Jews together, even those who are going to the Hamburg synagogue, and not only do we need to see ourselves as Europeans who are unified with the people around us, I think he's also referring to the Chassam Sofer and Rabbi Bennett, who wrote against him in the book of the Hamburg Bezdin. I think he sees that as a violation of do not hate your brother in your heart. And he says, I've already warned above and talked about, you're obligated to love the other just like yourself, and you're not allowed to hate them. And it says in Cain, as harat lotisna, ein lamakom zula simchata chavera. What does it mean not to hate your brother in your heart? It means you don't hate them if they never sinned, if they're righteous. So Torah doesn't have to command you not to hate them in your heart. Torah is commanding this to you because they did something bad. Either they did something, Gemara does say this, they did something to you, or they did something that you see as negative. You're still not allowed to hate them in your heart. You're supposed to rebuke them. Now, on the other hand, it says you're supposed to rebuke them. So I guess people at Hammer Besna could argue, yeah, we're rebuking. That's what we're doing. They did something that takes away the connection of love. And nevertheless, Torah commands us not to hate them. Kol Ishmi Yisrael, he says here, Musa Shleishma Chadrei Abelo. You're not allowed to hate other Jews. Okay, and this is basically what he's talking about here. And how a lot of mitzvot apply to Jews and to non-Jews if they're not idolaters. And then he says, Azhara Chemdat, and then it's interesting, he gives sort of Musar. Right, he's sort of giving, what's he doing here? He's kind of giving like about 20 or 30 principles. And I think what he's trying to do, he's trying to highlight the commandments between us and other people, and the sort of tikkun hamidot, to the perfection of character. He says, Azhara chemdat atanu, the rabbis warn us not to delve too much into pleasure. And then we're not supposed to love money too much or seek after it. I mean, it's hard to we're not supposed to steal. So it's interesting what he's saying. He's sort of listing kind of the Ten Commandments a little bit, and he quotes some halachic work here. It's something good that somebody did for a non-Jew in Tanakh. Not only are you not allowed to deceive your neighbor or Hana means to like do business badly with your neighbor, whether they're a Jew or a non-Jew. With regard to something monetary is forbidden, but you're not even allowed to persecute them with words. It says, now we would probably assume halachically this is another Jew, but he's extending all of the things that we have to be careful about with other Jews to non-Jews. He's arguing that applies to anybody who's not an idolater, and that's not a crazy argument. It says, if you lend money to my nation, this is pretty radical. Don't be always pushing to get paid back. As harsh, you shouldn't pressure the poor person to pay you back. If you know that they can't. He's saying this applies to anybody who does not worship idols, as it says, achicha. In other words, once he's defined achicha, your brother, as anybody who doesn't worship idols, now every Christian in Europe is achicha, it's your brother. That means you can't pressure them to pay you back a loan, and shockingly, he's going to do away with interest. You're not going to be able to charge anybody interest. I don't know what he would do with all the Jewish banking. Says they have a law of ger toshav. There's a category called ger toshav, a stranger who lives in your midst, who does not worship idols, keeps the 7 laws of Noah, and you do have obligations to them. It doesn't just say people from your nation, it says the poor person is with you, to tell you that any poor person that dwells among you, a ger toshav, which is a certain halachic category, is called Ami, is called part of your nation. I mean, this is interesting, right? And that's what he's saying is it's sort of shocking. He's saying we are Jews, but we're also Europeans. We are part of that nation. They're part of our nation. We see in 3 places that a ger toshav, a stranger who lives among you, is called your people. Is referring to how you have to make sure that they have food for Yom Tov, I think. This is about lending them money. He's saying that anybody, he's saying from the Talmud, anybody who does some mitzvot is called part of your nation. It's called your brother. So whenever it says your brother in the Torah, he's saying it doesn't just mean Jews. He's very clear about this. He says, if you lend money to your friend, whether a Jew or a non-Jew, you're not allowed to charge interest. As it says, when your brother is poor, and they live with you, there it says say ger v'toshav, it does say that, and they live with you, don't take. Now this probably in the Torah, this is referring to living in Israel and not just to live with you. If you live in Europe, does this apply? So he's arguing that it does. Perish Amar Chazal, the rabbis say, B'Torah's Kohanim ger ze ger tzedek. The rabbis in the Medrash on Vayikra say that ger, the stranger who lives with you, is talking about a righteous convert. The toshav, one who lives with you, it's ger v'toshav, two separate terms. That's ger ochel nevelos. That is not somebody who converts to Judaism. That is somebody who lives with you and eats non-kosher food. No, they're not a Jew. But they're all called your poor. He says, how do you understand this? Anybody who says is not worshiping idols is included in this, because it says ger v'toshav, stranger and the one who dwells with you. Anybody who doesn't worship idols, does some of the commandments, is called your brother. And I mean, I don't know how that practically would work. I mean, there were bankers for sure among Jews in Europe, but I think that was a big business for Jews. I mean, to do away, unless he would say that you could charge the people who don't live among you, but he says Europe. Which is very surprising. I'd be interesting to see, I should look this up, is there halachic grounds for this? In other words, is there anybody else who says that a non-Jew who keeps the 7 laws of Noah does not worship idols? He's assuming here, obviously, that Christianity is not idolatry. There's some argument about that. That you can't charge them interest. That would be very interesting to see. I'll try and look into that, because it's really, on a practical level, it's going to make it very hard for the Jews. You have to care for the Yatom and the Almanah. You have to care for them. He's saying, he's really defining the concept of your brethren in Judaism to be extremely wide, to include everybody in Europe, basically, every Christian. And so that's his vision, I think. That's where he's coming from, right? He's saying, hey, like, right now in 2022, we live at a time when there's growing anti-Semitism. We live after the Holocaust. For us, it's not hard to see ourselves as separate. But in 1820, it's a little different. It's soon after the Enlightenment, and there's a sense of being part of the bigger world. And that's his vision. That's what he's saying. He's saying we Jews should not be insular and separate. We need to own up to the fact that he's saying the Torah is commanding us to treat our fellow Europeans as our brethren. So that's where he's coming from, I think. It's not crazy. I mean, he's certainly grounded in halachic terms. And, would everybody agree? I don't know, but it certainly seems to be some grounds for it. But I will look and see this idea of not charging interest to non-Jews who keep sentiments of Noah. That is very surprising, because putting Jews in a very difficult position. I'll check into that. Okay, have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.